The storm had left its mark on my little farm, battering the old barn that stood as a testament to decades of hard work. Shingles were missing, beams sagged dangerously, and the door hung off its hinges. I stood there, surveying the damage, the ache in my heart matching the throb in my arthritic knees. I was no stranger to hardship. Life on the farm, especially after losing my husband 3 years ago, was never easy. But this storm seemed determined to remind me of my limitations. My neighbor, Mr. Klein, had been a good friend ever since my husband passed. His son, Ethan, had just moved back from the city after finishing college. I'd seen him a few times since his return, tall, lean, with an easy smile and a polite manner that reminded me of simpler times. It was Ethan who offered to help fix the barn. "You can't tackle this alone, Mrs. Hall," he said, his voice firm yet kind as he stood at my doorstep. His jeans were dusty from work, his hair tousled by the wind. "Let me help." I hesitated. "It's a lot of work, Ethan. You've got your own life to manage." He smiled, a dimple appearing in his cheek. "It's no trouble at all. Besides, I could use the exercise." The next morning, Ethan arrived with a toolbox in hand and a determination that was almost contagious. We spent hours side by side, clearing debris and assessing what needed to be done. I couldn't help but notice how strong and capable he was, the way he moved with confidence and purpose. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, we took a break, sitting on the edge of the wooden fence. Ethan handed me a bottle of water, his eyes crinkling with amusement as he said, "You've been working harder than I expected, Mrs. Hall." "I'm impressed." I laughed softly, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "Call me Eleanor, Ethan. Mrs. Hall makes me sound ancient." His grin widened. "Eleanor it is. You don't look a day over 40, by the way." I rolled my eyes but couldn't suppress the blush that crept into my cheeks. It had been years since anyone had complimented me like that, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. By the third day, the barn started to take shape again. We replaced beams, hammered nails, and cleared out years of accumulated dust and cobwebs. Ethan's presence was a comfort, his energy and laughter making the work feel less like a chore. But there was something else, something unspoken that hung in the air between us. One afternoon, as we worked together to hoist a new beam into place, I stumbled slightly, and Ethan caught me by the arm. His grip was firm, steadying me as his eyes met mine. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "Wouldn't want you getting hurt." I nodded, my breath catching as I realized how close we were. His hand lingered for a moment before he let go, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. That evening, Ethan insisted on staying for dinner as a thank you for his help. We sat at the small kitchen table, the aroma of roasted chicken filling the air. "You've built a life here that's truly admirable," he said, his voice earnest as he looked around the cozy kitchen. "I can see why my dad respects you so much." I smiled, feeling a swell of pride. It hasn't been easy, but this farm has been my home for decades. It's all I know. Ethan's gaze lingered on me, and I felt the same unspoken tension that had been growing between us all week. "You've done more than most people could ever manage," he said softly. "It's inspiring." His words sent a warmth through me that I hadn't felt in years, and for the first time, I found myself looking at Ethan not as the boy who had grown up next door, but as a man. After dinner, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The air was cool, and the gentle rustle of the trees created a soothing backdrop to our conversation. "Thank you for all your help, Ethan," I said, my voice quieter than usual. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He turned to me, his expression serious, yet kind. "It's been my pleasure, Eleanor."
"Really?"
For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then Ethan reached out, his hand brushing mine. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, I knew that whatever was happening between us was real. I should have pulled my hand away, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself staring into Ethan's eyes, searching for something, a reason to stop, a reason to let go. His hand lingered on mine, warm and steady, and for a moment, the years between us seemed to vanish. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the rustling trees. "I don't know how to explain this, but I feel like I've found something here. Something I didn't know I was missing." His words struck a chord deep within me, one I hadn't realized was there. I pulled my hand back, clasping it tightly in my lap as I struggled to find the right words. "You're young, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "You have your whole life ahead of you. Whatever this is, it's not right." Ethan leaned closer, his expression earnest. "I know how it sounds. Believe me, I've been trying to make sense of it myself. But I can't ignore what I feel when I'm around you. That night, I couldn't sleep." Ethan's words replayed in my mind, weaving themselves into my dreams and stirring emotions I thought I'd buried long ago. I got up and paced the small living room, the moonlight streaming through the windows. The house felt emptier than ever, and I couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's touch, the warmth of his hand on mine. When morning came, I was no closer to answers. The following day, the weather took a turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and a steady drizzle soaked the farm. Ethan arrived as usual, undeterred by the rain. "We need to secure the barn before the storm gets worse," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. We worked in near silence, the rain drumming against the roof as we secured loose planks and covered the hay bales with tarps. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the previous evening. As we finished up, Ethan turned to me, his hair damp and curling slightly at the edges. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Is it because of what people might think? Or is it because you don't feel the same ways?" I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. "Ethan, it's not that simple. You're my neighbor's son. You're young and you're incredible," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You're strong, kind, and more than anyone I've ever met. Why can't that be enough?" Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind slammed the barn door shut, startling us both. The noise echoed in the confined space, but neither of us moved. Ethan reached out, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His hand lingered, and I felt my resolve slipping. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't name. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't pretend anymore. Not when I feel this way." I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened them again, Ethan was still there, his gaze unwavering. "You should go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Before we do something we can't take back." But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand cupping my face as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in the faintest of kisses. It was as if time stopped. The world outside the barn disappeared, leaving only the two of us, suspended in that fragile, electric moment. The kiss ended as softly as it began, but the impact lingered. My cheeks flushed as I took a step back, my hands trembling. Ethan didn't say a word. He just stood there, his eyes searching mine, as if waiting for me to make the next move. This can't happen," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's not right." "It feels right," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Doesn't it?" I looked away, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. He wasn't wrong. Deep down, I couldn't deny the warmth his touch had ignited, the way his presence filled a void I didn't even realize was there. But I couldn't admit that, not to him, not even to myself. "I think you should go home," I said finally, my voice firmer than I felt. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but instead he nodded. "I'll go. But this isn't over, Eleanor." The days that followed were unbearable. Ethan didn't come to the farm, and the absence of his laughter, his presence, made everything feel emptier. I tried to immerse myself in the chores, but my thoughts always wandered back to him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch, staring at the fields. The silence was oppressive, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. I was startled by the sound of footsteps. Turning, I saw Ethan walking up the path, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply, stopping at the bottom of the steps. I didn't know what to say. My heart ached at the sight of him, but the uncertainty of what this meant loomed over me. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice softer now. "And I get it. You're scared."
So am I.
"But I can't let fear stop me from telling you how I feel." "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off. "No, let me finish," he said, stepping closer. "I've never felt this way before, about anyone. And I don't know what to do with it, but I know I don't want to lose you." Tears stung my eyes as I looked at him. His words were raw, unfiltered, and they echoed the emotions I'd been trying to suppress. "This is complicated," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "People wouldn't understand." "I don't care what people think," Ethan said, his voice firm. "All I care about is you." Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle yet insistent. "Come with me," he said, his eyes pleading. "Where?" I asked, my voice trembling.
"To the barn," he replied.
"Just trust me." I hesitated, but something in his gaze made it impossible to refuse. I followed him across the yard, the cool night air brushing against my skin. Inside the barn, the familiar scent of hay and wood surrounded us, grounding me even as my emotions swirled. Ethan turned to face me, his expression softer now. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready for," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know how much you mean to me." The sincerity in his words broke down the last of my defenses. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of what it meant. But as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, the hesitation melted away. We spent the rest of the evening in the barn, talking, laughing, and stealing kisses in the dim light of the single lantern. For the first time in years, I felt alive, seen, and cherished. The following morning, the world outside the barn seemed almost unchanged, as if it hadn't just witnessed my entire life shift in the span of a few hours. The golden light of dawn streamed through the barn slats, painting everything in soft, warm hues. I stirred awake on a makeshift bed of hay, Ethan's arm draped protectively over me. For a moment, I allowed myself to relish the peace of the moment. His steady breathing, the warmth of his presence, it all felt so surreal. But reality was never far behind. What had we done? We moved about the morning chores as though nothing had happened, but the tension between us was undeniable. Every glance felt loaded, every brush of our hands deliberate. As we worked, I couldn't help but notice the way Ethan's demeanor had changed. He wasn't just the helpful neighbor's son anymore. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his focus shifting toward me in ways that made my heart race. But it was more than that. Beneath the surface, I saw the same uncertainty that plagued my own mind. By the afternoon, the sound of a truck engine echoed across the yard. My stomach tightened as Mr. Klein, Ethan's father, stepped out of the cab. He waved cheerfully, but there was a sharpness in his gaze when he spotted Ethan working beside me. "Hope you two haven't been overworking yourselves," he said, his tone light but his eyes lingering on his son. Ethan offered a casual shrug. "Just helping Eleanor out, Dad. The barn's looking good again." I forced a smile, my hands gripping the edge of my apron. Mr. Klein's presence reminded me of the fine line Ethan and I were walking. Later that evening, as the sun set over the fields, Ethan and I found ourselves alone on the porch. The weight of the day hung heavy between us, and for the first time, I didn't know what to say. "You're worried about him finding out," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Of course I am," I admitted, my voice shaking. "What we're doing, it's not something people would understand." Ethan reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "It's not about them. It's about us. What we feel, it's real, Eleanor. Doesn't that matter more than their judgment?" His words were a lifeline, but the doubts in my heart were too loud to ignore. In the days that followed, Ethan became my anchor. We worked together as we always had, but the stolen glances, The quiet moments in the barn made everything feel different. One evening, as the stars lit up the night sky, Ethan led me to the top of the hill overlooking the farm. He spread out an old quilt, and we sat together in the cool grass, the sounds of the farm fading into the background. "I've never felt this way before," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "I didn't know it was possible to feel so much for someone." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him. "Neither did I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. As he leaned in to kiss me, the doubts and fears melted away. In that moment, it didn't matter what the world thought. All that mattered was us. The next morning, I was hanging freshly laundered sheets on the clothesline when Mr. Klein's truck rumbled up the driveway. My heart sank as I saw him step out with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice calm but laced with something I couldn't place. "Morning," I replied, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for another clothespin. "What brings you by?" He gestured toward the barn. "I wanted to check out the repairs Ethan's been working on. He's spent a lot of time over here lately, hasn't he?" My pulse quickened, but I forced a smile. "He's been a tremendous help. I couldn't have managed without him." Mr. Klein nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. Ethan appeared from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair tousled. "Hey, Dad," he called, his tone light but his eyes darting nervously between us. "Thought I'd come see how things were going," Mr. Klein said, his voice casual but his posture tense. Ethan walked over, standing closer to me than I was comfortable with. The subtle protective gesture didn't go unnoticed by his father. "Everything's shaping up nicely," Ethan said, his tone even. "We're nearly done with the repairs." "Good to hear," Mr. Klein replied, but his gaze never left me. That evening, Ethan found me in the kitchen, where I was nervously scrubbing dishes that didn't need cleaning. "He knows," I said quietly, not looking up from the sink. Ethan stepped closer, placing his hands on my shoulders. "He doesn't know anything for sure." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "You didn't see the way he looked at me, Ethan. He suspects something, and if he finds out—" Ethan turned me to face him, his expression firm. "It doesn't matter. Let him think what he wants. I'm not going to let anyone ruin this." His confidence should have reassured me, but instead, it made my fears grow. The next day, I was in the barn sorting tools when I heard voices outside. Peeking through a crack in the wooden door, I saw Mr. Klein and Ethan standing near the truck. Their voices were low, but the tension was palpable. "What's going on between you and Eleanor's?" Mr. Klein demanded, his tone sharp. "Nothing you need to worry about," Ethan replied, his voice steady but defensive. Mr. Klein stepped closer, his face inches from Ethan's. "Don't lie to me, boy. I see the way you look at her." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I held my breath, waiting for Ethan's response. Ethan squared his shoulders, meeting his father's gaze. "I care about her, Dad. More than I've ever cared about anyone." Mr. Klein's expression darkened. "She's old enough to be your mother. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "I don't care what they say," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "Eleanor makes me happy, and that's all that matters to me." Tears stung my eyes as I listened to their heated exchange. I wanted to intervene, to defend Ethan, but my legs felt like lead. That evening, Ethan came to find me in the barn, his face flushed with emotion. "He knows," he said simply, his voice thick with frustration. I nodded, my chest tight with guilt. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted to cause trouble for you." He stepped closer, his hand gently cupping my cheek. "You didn't. This is my choice, Eleanor. And I'm not going to let anyone take it away from me." The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He was resolute, but I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. This wasn't just about us anymore. His father knew, and that knowledge could unravel everything. That night, as I lay in bed, the house felt too quiet. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed amplified, mirroring the turmoil in my heart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Klein might do. A soft knock at the door startled me. Pulling on a robe, I opened it to find Ethan standing there, his face shadowed by the dim light of the porch. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. We sat together at the kitchen table, the faint glow of the moon streaming through the window. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly as if trying to hold himself together. "He's angry," he said finally, "but he'll come around. He always does." I shook my head, doubt clouding my thoughts. What if he doesn't, Ethan? What if this ruins your relationship with him? Ethan reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "I don't care. Losing you would be worse." His words hit me like a wave, both comforting and terrifying. I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall completely into the safety of his love. But the world outside this kitchen felt too big, too judgmental. The next morning, as I was tending to the garden, I saw Mr. Klein's truck rumble up the driveway. My stomach twisted into knots. He climbed out, his expression a mix of determination and anger. "We need to talk," he said curtly. I nodded, wiping my hands on my apron as he followed me to the porch. Once we were seated, he wasted no time. "I don't know what's going on between you and my son, but it needs to stop," he said, his tone sharp. "Mr. Klein." "I'm serious, Eleanor," he interrupted. "He's young, impressionable. You're taking advantage of him." His accusation stung, but I kept my composure. Ethan is a grown man, capable of making his own decisions. This isn't something I forced on him. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you know what people will say? Do you know how this will affect him?" I met his gaze, refusing to back down. "People will always find something to talk about. But this farm, this life, it's all I have." "And Ethan?" "He's brought joy back into it in a way I didn't think was possible." For a moment, he seemed taken aback, but the tension in his jaw didn't ease. "This is a mistake, Eleanor. And if you care about him as much as you say you do, you'll end it." After Mr. Klein left, I sat on the porch, staring out at the fields. His words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the stakes we were up against. When Ethan returned from an errand in town, he immediately sensed my distress. "What happened?" he asked, sitting beside me. "Your father was here," I admitted, my voice trembling. "He wants me to end this." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And what do you want?" I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of my decision. "I want you, Ethan. But I don't want to be the reason you lose your family." Ethan took my hands in his grip firm. "You're not taking me away from anything. This is my choice, Eleanor. And I choose you." Tears welled in my eyes as his words wrapped around me like a warm embrace. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Then we'll face this together," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion coursing through me. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Ethan smiled, his dimples deepening as he leaned in, brushing a kiss against my forehead. "Together," he echoed. In the days that followed, the tension with Mr. Klein didn't dissipate, but Ethan and I stood firm. The farm became our sanctuary, a place where the outside world couldn't reach us. One evening, as we sat on the hill overlooking the fields, Ethan pulled me close, his arms wrapped protectively around me. "I love you, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "I love you too," I replied, my heart swelling with a mix of joy and certainty. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. And as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I knew we'd face whatever came next together.